I've been a lawyer for 35 years, and as a Christian as well, I think that the evidence for the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ is very strong. So strong that I think we can be sure, as a matter of historical fact, that this is something that really happened.
Well, I think we'd like to take issue with you on that, Graeme. We're going to give you a bit of pushback on that in this programme.
Okay.
Well, that was fantastic.
But welcome to Doubts Aloud, and we're so pleased you can join us.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
We're going to be airing our loud doubts. That's
I love it.
No shouting, though.
No shouting.
Graeme, were you a barrister before a judge?
No, I started out life as a solicitor. For the first 15 years of my career after my training, I was a solicitor in practice up in the northwest in Manchester, doing mainly civil litigation of different types, basically all involving money in various ways, shapes or forms. And then after that, I transferred, applied, became what's called a district judge, working in the county court, doing again civil work and some family work, and then made a further change 7 years ago, became a circuit judge, so that I'm now doing exclusively criminal work. So I've done sort of quite a wide range over the last 35, 36 years.
And we were inspired to ask you to join us on the programme because of your book. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, thanks. About 10 years ago, I had this idea as a lawyer and a Christian that it would be interesting to look at the evidence for the resurrection from both the standpoint of a Christian, obviously, but also from the standpoint of a lawyer. And that sort of grew and became a book called Was the Tomb Empty, which was published, I think, from memory in 2014. And that seems to have found its way into your hands somehow. And that's why I'm here today.
Yes, and we can put a link in the show notes, can't we, Ed, to Graeme's book?
Oh, absolutely.
So that anybody wants to order it.
Like at Amazon and various.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I believe it's still available on Amazon.
It definitely is. Yeah, it definitely
right.
is.
I was going to say, I don't go on and check regularly.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Famously, Who Moved the Stone, everybody thought was written by a lawyer, but it wasn't.
No, it wasn't. That was one of the interesting things that sort of came up when I was looking at the book. I was trying to source a lot of things back to their original source and not just rely on rumours and hearsay, as it were. And it transpires he wasn't a lawyer at all. In fact, I don't think he ever said he was a lawyer. I suspect it's just because of the sort of forensic way in which he goes about analysing the evidence. People made that assumption, and once somebody had made it and said it authoritatively, as sometimes happens, it was just picked up by everybody else.
Well, funny you should say that, because we probably take the view that some of the gospel material is exacthe that.
Yeah, I thought you would, which is partly why I said it, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
So, Andrew, are you ready to kick off? Because we thought what we'd do, rather than all three of us piling in on Graeme, who's just there by himself flying the Christian flag, we try and sort of split it into three and keep it to fairly much to one person at a time, challenging Graeme on certain aspects of his book. So do you want to kick off, Andrew?
I can do. Yeah, I can do. I read the specific chapters that with the questions that I brought up, but I also read more of your book just anyway, but I was focusing on chapters 4, 13 and 15. I came to it's interesting when you come to a book like this, particularly having done studied theology and stuff, and sort of read fairly widely on this. I noticed things like I don't know, I almost like I felt that in chapter 4, for example, that obviously you didn't have great long chapters in detail, so you could only sort of sum up things, I think, but I felt that some assumptions were already in place.
What was chapter 4 on, Andrew?
On chapter 4, so that was the one that's talking about real evidence, and I think you went through I was going to go through here.
Chapter 4 is just about evidence.
It's about
the concept of evidence.
And it was but as we were moving through that, I was just picking up that almost like genre possibilities were just not mentioned. And so the idea almost as if I almost got, I don't know if that's how you felt that you were approaching it, but I almost felt like that these are purportedly records right off the bat, but are they accurate or not? Rather than what about the possibilities of genre? What about the possibilities, like a lot of scholars argue that common, say, either Old Testament memes, if you like, were being used, or even Roman ones, and they weren't actually necessarily writing a history that was meant to be understood as a history in reality. And so right off the bat, it was like there could have been another chapter to say, this is why it's not all of those things. This is a record. Is it accurate or not? And so that was one of the questions I had for you. What sort of work did you do in the scholarship that had scholars that did say things like that about the Gospels in terms of the... Well,
yeah, I think you've picked up on chapter 4, where I was really trying to just address the issue of what evidence is and what evidence we might actually have when we're looking at the resurrection. I'm look more specifically at the Gospels in chapter 13, and I think, in fairness, I do actually look there at what genre it might be, and in particular, that are we looking at history? Are we looking at theologically interpreted history, or what? So I think I do pick that up.
Yeah, I think so. In sort of, but rather, I suppose so. Yes, in a sort of, but it seemed to just go right back to, this is actually history. I felt probably quite selective people that you were sourcing from, rather than I was expecting you to say, someone like, I don't know, just other areas, and say there are, of course, Christian, more liberal scholars who would say this about the Gospels, and right. And so it would be more like I suppose it was more like, and that I suppose the questions that I do have for my sections was more like there was various points where I felt a new reader who didn't know anything might not go away with what could have been more informative, and so it would be more like laid out, rather than it was almost like it was just quickly bypassed, and so there were various sort of elements. I mean, and one of the things from chapter 4, by the way, just to go back to that, was the real evidence.
Yeah, that
actually the best evidence was, in fact, what's the quote I've got here? Yes, you said that the most satisfactory kind of evidence is what you were calling real evidence, which was material evidence, which is actually something that we don't have at all.
We don't. And I think what I'm trying to do there is to explain categories of evidence, what evidence is generally available. I'm not sure, maybe I should have said this, that we'd actually expect to find any real evidence in relation to something that happened 2,000 years ago. But just coming back, if I can, to the point you just made, you probably have seen that my approach is to leave the Gospels very much to the end of what I'm looking at, because of the problems that I acknowledge, or the challenges that can be raised to them, the challenges to authorship, the challenges to dating, and so on. So I'm not in any way advancing them sort of at the forefront of what I put forward, very much the opposite.
All right. So would that counter for the fact that, say, one of the things I noticed, say, in writing about, when you moved on to, say, Paul, and you talked about Paul's letters, was, it's widely accepted, this is one of the note I made, widely accepted that he was a writer of many letters. I thought that was a very interesting phrase, when I would have said that actually most mainstream scholars argue that Paul wrote 7 and that the others were written, someone was writing in Paul's name, just to inform the audience that that is the state of the play at the moment. Whereas coming away from that verse, it was like there was nothing to hint at that Paul didn't write, that basically you come away thinking, well, he obviously wrote all 13, or that's the implication that I could have taken from that. And yet you did go on to mention that 2 Peter, not 2 Peter, that's another question, by the way, but you did go on to mention that the Gospel of Peter was widely accepted to be, obviously a forgery, or not written by real Peter, which I found rather interesting, because you could equally have said that about 7 letters of Paul, 2 Peter, 1 Peter, James, loads of them, but you didn't seem to mention them.
Well, I mean, I've got the just looked it up in front of me. What I say in relation, the strong scholarly consensus that Paul wrote many, if not most, of the New Testament letters attributed to him. I don't think I'm trying to mislead. I think I'm trying to be. I've deliberately not descended into detail. This wasn't, as you say.
No, I realise none of this is descending into detail.
And I hope that I've been open to those issues. I agree with you on 2 Peter. I could have and perhaps should have said. I think I quote maybe once from it. I should have said that it's almost universally agreed that was not written by Peter.
Absolutely, and probably the best case to make is fact that, and of course, I was just picking up that in the sense that, I remember when I was at college, and I remember the New Testament lecturer was saying now 7 of the letters, 6 of Paul's letters in his name are not reckoned to be by him, and I remember, I was certainly nearly fell off my chair. Because I went up to the New Testament lecturer and I said, now, this is purely like liberals. As long as liberals hold it, I'd be fine. But they didn't. He said, no, a lot of evangelicals hold that as well. And to a varying different scales of how many books. Yeah. So I just thought, I suppose probably it's down to space then. You didn't really have space to sort of go down that little avenue. But I thought,
was this when you were an evangelical yourself?
Yes.
So you would have felt comfortable because you could have dismissed it.
Yeah, you could see my bias right there.
Those crazy liberals. What are they? What do they know?
That's exactly my mindset. I was just waiting for him to say, no, there's the evangelical liberal split here. And I thought, okay, but when you get a mix and a match between scholars of different stripes, you think, oh God, there must be something to this. And that was just one aspect. So again, to go back to evidence and which you're making for your case, I was thinking that a few more things, and there's a number of other things I made points on, but I won't mention them now, but that were actually similar to that. I felt that you were sort of bypassing, and another one was the Protestant assumption of how the Bible came together. You seem to sort of bypass the fact that millions and millions of Catholics wouldn't have agreed with that about how the New Testament authentically self-authenticated itself, which is very much a Protestant view. Yeah. So a comment like, but of course Catholics don't take that view. They see that the authority of the church placed a lot of emphasis on what books were what. At least they don't talk about it as self-authenticating. So anyway, so I was just thinking your original building blocks to me were more just, I don't know, coming up at me. It's like, oh gosh, it might be a surprise for a later reader of your book to then be a little bit surprised when they read someone else saying something. So that was
right.
Really...
I mean, certainly chapter 4 is part of a section which really is just aiming to set out some principles of approach as a lawyer that I'm going to use. So I'm not really trying to deal with any of the issues in any great detail there. I picked them up later on in some of the other chapters that you've read, in relation to the Gospels, in relation to Paul and so on.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, the notion of obviously being a lawyer, and I can absolutely imagine, being a lawyer and talking about the concepts of eyewitnesses is absolutely part of the whole language that would obviously be there. But again, even in that area, I found that again, it was very much there is an evangelical sort of almost liberal split on this, because the standard evangelical view is that the gospel authors there's traditions to them, and it's not totally standard even with evangelical, but Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, and then John, and then Mark was a sort of cohort of Peter, and Luke was following Paul around. And so whereas the mainstream academic do not accept that at all, and they say that none of it is actually eyewitness authors, and it's very questionable whether it actually goes back to this is where it comes into genre as well. And so I found that was almost like we'll sort of go past that quite quickly, and we'll get right back to the fact that, we need to just take them as the traditional evangelical view of authorship, and then we can move on. Whereas I think it's almost like you've got you're building blocks on a very shaky foundation immediately, I found in this area. So but you did mention, are they written later? And if they were, then they wouldn't be quite in the same position as the common evangelical view. So what would you say about that?
Well, I think, in fairness, I think when I look at the Gospels, I think I acknowledge head on that there are a number of issues, and one big issue is authorship. I say that only one of them arguably purports to be written by an eyewitness or based directly on one eyewitness, and that is John. Luke does say that he's investigated it, but there's no suggestion in either Mark or Matthew that they are, in fact, the work of eyewitnesses. And I also raise the question of dating. Now, I think from some preliminary exchanges we've had, the view that I've expressed, which I understood to be a generally accepted view when I was writing about dating, things may have moved on a bit by then. But certainly what I've read, going right back to John Robinson, for example, who can be by no means described as an evangelical, is looking at dating all the Gospels in the second half of the first century.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a move. I mean, that was almost like, I suppose, a radical exception in that view. I mean, there's definitely something I've been looked into. I think I mentioned it to you, Ed, that there's been a move, including Mark Goodacre, actually, which really surprised me recently. But I mean, even he about Acts, Luke and Acts being early first century now, which is quite a shock to the
second century.
Early first century. That would be amazing.
Be a real shock.
Before Jesus. Wow. Early second century. So and that's because of evidence that say Mark Goodacre was persuaded that Luke actually used Josephus, which pushes and therefore John gets knocked on. So Mark Goodacre was actually quite surprised when I heard him actually say quite confidently that he had changed his view, and that Acts goes around about 115 for various arguments. And there's a whole book about it actually that you can get about all these scholars that are sort of acknowledging that particular trend at the moment. But again, it's probably a smaller portion than the mainstream, but things start somewhere. But it is interesting that right now in the 21st century, you've got people actually thinking things are pushed back a bit, not actually going earlier. But it's all an open thing. Nobody can really be that dogmatic, I don't think. But again, obviously 10 years ago, you wouldn't even be able to mention that because there wasn't really that push that way. I don't know if Ed or Francis has got anything to say on that dating aspect.
It's not my area,
right?
so
Okay,
I'll leave it to you. You're the expert.
I mean, I'm certainly aware of common and latest sort of trends in scholarship, whether it's evangelical or liberal or mainstream, and so that's definitely in the last couple of years that's been happening. But yeah, so I think that was really the points I've had to make about the building blocks, I suppose, of these chapters. And the references. I suppose the one last thing I'd want to mention is the again, a bit more work has been done on this perhaps since you wrote 10 years ago. I've certainly come across what's almost become a myth in evangelicalism, which is that the disciples died as martyrs, and that's there's been some books even by evangelical people that are actually admitting that we shouldn't really say it like that. And there's been mainline ones like Candida Moss, isn't it? Who did?
I think that's her name.
Yeah,
yes,
right.
The myth of martyrdom. And even though the opposite view is coming from the other name that you mentioned, Francis.
No,
Ed, you mentioned
Sean
the other name. I mentioned Candida Moss.
Sean McDowell did a massive study in it himself as an evangelical, and even he, I think, was quite surprised that myth didn't hold up in the full extent that it's been said. Yeah. He said actually you can whittle it down to 2 or 3, but not the whole thing that they died for as martyrs. I'm
going to undermine all of this anyway.
Right, okay.
So I wouldn't worry.
Yeah, and then
I think they genuinely believe their stuff. So that's what the die for a lie argument is all about.
Yes, I don't think we think that they were consciously lying. We just
no. I just think that we don't know historically what actually happened to them, because the stories of their martyrdom are embedded in the most crazy stories. Yeah.
Sorry, it looked like Graeme was leaving the conversation.
It's like, okay, I've had enough of this. For anyone listening,
arguing with each other.
For anyone listening, we're on video here, and sort of Graeme is gone.
Graeme briefly went off camera, and we thought we'd offended him.
Yeah. But, no. No, I don't mean anything about. I firmly think that whatever they believed, they believed it. But it's the stories in which those martyrdom things come about. They come in the most in any other area, if you were to say this happened, like John was put in boiling water or something, or a fish flew with the Peter story and things like this, or these later traditions. So when you say tradition says, you have to include all that other stuff, which no evangelical really believes is true at all, that I know of anyway, in these 2nd and 3rd century documents. So when it comes to historical methods, it basically can't be said that they died for Christ.
I agree that.
And so that's the thing. And then, but it just pointed on as well, the one other latest development in scholarship in recent, say 10 years, is this number of heavyweights that are coming out to say that the story of the tomb itself is in fact legendary and wasn't what Paul had in mind when he talked about Jesus being buried. It was a later development by the time we get to Mark, and the tradition started to build up. And so they're asked, like Bart Ehrman has come out with this now himself, and he didn't used to think that.
No, I was going to say he's one of the people I would have mentioned if
back 10 years ago he would have said absolutely there was an empty tomb, and then you've got to have either a natural reason or a supernatural one. But now he doesn't actually believe there was an empty tomb, and that's not one of the arguments. So there we go. That's my bit of looking your book. So I just wanted to throw those elements out in a more general sense.
So is there anything that you want to say, Graeme, because we want to give you the last word on each
the martyrs
segment.
And the tomb.
So
I've got a question as well.
Oh, okay. Far away then.
So, Graeme, how much do you feel your overall argument depends on the Gospels having a really good chunk of eyewitness material?
I don't think it does.
Okay. Yeah.
No, because I think the overall. I don't know how many of you had the chance to read the whole of the book. It's not a criticism if you haven't. But what my overall sort of suggestion is that an explanation, to be a viable explanation of what actually happened and what happened in the 1st century that resulted in the early church, it has to be able to deal with the empty tomb. Well, we just touched on that. We may come back to that.
Yeah.
The transformed lives of the early disciples and the growth of the early church as it grew. And anything that doesn't explain all 3 of those doesn't give a full and valid explanation. Now, you can make that argument, in fact, placing almost no, if any, weight on the Gospels. And obviously, I don't believe that the Gospels have no weight, but it's deliberately why I left them very much to the end, because I'm aware that it's very controversial, and I'm aware that for a lot of evangelical Christians, it's the beginning and the end. You know, that it says this in the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 4 separate independent accounts. Boom, end of story. And that's something, you know, I don't want to undermine anyone's sort of very straightforward and simplistic faith, but you can't argue it on that basis.
Yeah, you mean like they're not independent as one of them?
Yeah, I mean, there are loads of issues, but and I'm sure we'll touch on it, that there are inconsistencies in them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, perhaps I should. Is it okay? Shall I
Absolutely.
go next?
Yep.
Okay. Right. So the first thing I wanted to take up with you, Graeme, was an issue which I don't want to take a long time on it, because you have a fairly light touch on it, but it was just something that I wanted to push back on a bit, which is where you say at page 127, judges and juries are extremely skeptical about witnesses whose accounts agree exactly, particularly when they relate to events which were unplanned and unexpected. And I don't have any problem with anyone saying that discrepancies in witness accounts are not fatal. I don't have a problem with that at all. Completely go along with that. It's always going to be, it's a lawyer's favorite phrase, question of fact and degree. But I couldn't agree with saying that it's an actual disbenefit to have witnesses all consistent. I mean, unless they're consistent in their phraseology, like 3 witnesses all say, we walked in and saw the window that had been broken in 3 places. The grass had fallen inside the room. and there was blood on the sharpest piece of glass. If they all use those exact words, that's fishy. But if they all put it in, say, that thing, and there are no discrepancies, but they put it in a different order or use different words, I don't have a problem with that. And the reason I wanted to push back on it, and you may think, why do I bother to pick this up, one sentence in your whole book, is just because it is something I come across so often with people, where people will solemnly assure me, oh, you know what, lawyers and police officers hate it when there are no inconsistencies between witnesses. And I'm always thinking, well, I don't hate it. I don't mind if all my witnesses are consistent. I quite like it. So anyway, so I just wondered whether what you thought about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And a couple of points on that. Although it's not a direct quote, that was actually that was conveyed to me by he's retired now, but by a designated civil judge. So for the benefit of those of you who are not lawyers, that's the senior civil judge in a particular court centre. So he's responsible for the civil work in that court, and that's something that he said, which I thought, that's interesting. And I think it doesn't quite make the same point, but I give in the book my own experience. I've been a witness in a case once. It was when I was in my late teens, early 20s. It was an assault that happened outside my parents' house. Somebody came into our garden and picked up a brick, which I saw out the window. I went outside. There was an altercation going on. Cut a long story short, I was one of 4 witnesses to the altercation. The person who was hit with a brick, his partner, myself, and somebody who saw it from the other side of the road. There were some significant discrepancies in our evidence of a very short-lived incident. We couldn't even agree how many people were in the group that had been carrying out the attack. And I'm not talking about a huge group. There were sort of 3 or 4 people. That didn't prevent it was a magistrate's court, not a Crown court, didn't prevent the magistrates from finding the guy guilty. And that brought home to me the fact that it is, I think, very difficult in something of that nature to expect people to have a high degree of agreement in their accounts. And it is what I see regularly. Only last week I had a case where actually counsel for the defence was submitting to the jury in his closing speech that such were the similarities between the evidence of the 2 prosecution witnesses that it was clear they'd been colluding and it should be rejected.
Yes, I mean, I can see it as I don't know. I have to say, I can't ever remember where collusion has been suggested merely on the fact that there's a lack of discrepancies. But I think what we're probably coming to is questions of fact and degree. How serious are the discrepancies? Yes, I mean, okay. Well, I don't want to take too long over that because I think, I've made my point and you've made your point, and can perhaps move on to the other thing I wanted to talk to you about. And that was the argument that the Jewish and Roman authorities could have produced the body, which is an argument that's put out a lot. And I want to challenge that for a number of reasons, because I think firstly, there's no reason to believe that they knew what exactly early Christians were preaching until a relatively late stage in development of the Christian religion. And there's no reason I would say that other than the Gospels, we have no basis for knowing what they were preaching, or we have no basis for saying that they were definitely preaching the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So A, I think they didn't know. B, if they had known, why was that going to bother them? It seems to me that the indications again, and this is actually looking at the Gospels, that in the early days, this was a relatively small group of people. Why do they care what they're going around saying? And the final point was, I just can't see what would have been achieved by producing a body, because by the time, even if you take those other things, even if you take it that they get to know that the Christians are saying Jesus has risen, and that they are worried about this. The going on the documents that you're relying on, that didn't happen until Pentecost, about 50 days later. And by that time, how would the body have been recognizable? I mean, any body they produced, his own friends and family wouldn't have known him.
Yeah, I see the point you make. I think when we look at the development of the early church, as I understand it, that the preaching of the resurrection was central from the outset. It's central to their teaching and their practices. And that comes out not just in the Gospels, which we've already talked about, but in some of the letters as well. And if one does assume that this happened, let's say at Pentecost, 50 days after and following that, even if you can't point to a recognizable body, can't you point to a particular tomb? Can't you say, well, hang on a minute, you're talking about, you're making these outrageous claims. This was somebody who was buried in a tomb here. Then it's obvious there's going to be a body there.
Well, I suppose I think that the communal grave theory is the most likely theory, and that there then became a tradition that no, it was a bodily resurrection, and that as the Gospels developed, there became more and more emphasis on no, he was an actual human being, albeit that he did slightly strange things like, walk through walls and so on, and could appear, and I think possibly polylocation. But anyway, I think that as that grew, there then grew a need to establish, to start supposing, well, there must have been an empty tomb. But I would have said that the most likely thing was that it was a communal grave, and that they couldn't have found it 50 days later. And if they had found it, good luck working out which one is supposed to be Jesus. And I suppose I'd also like to push the question back at you, that if the empty tomb is so compelling, why didn't the apostles say to, rather than just preaching Jesus has risen, say to everyone, hey, follow us. Look, we'll show you the tomb. We'll show you. Look, there it is. It's empty.
Yeah, okay. 2 points coming to that, really. The first is the communal grave. I mean, I'm interested in what you say about that, because certainly when I was researching, writing a book, almost nobody seemed to hold the view that was even a feasible theory. And I know in the appendix to the book, I deal with a number of popular, so I'm not talking, going back to Andrew, I'm not talking about sort of, if you like, on the main part, serious theologians. I'm talking about books that you could, when I was writing, I literally could go into my local bookshop and pick these off the book or the library shelf. And almost all of them take as a starting point the empty tomb and start to give an explanation of it. And that includes the much more serious writer amongst those, Vermes, who's interesting because, of course, he like yourselves is or like some of you is an ex-Christian who went back to his Jewish roots. And he concludes by agreeing that there was an empty tomb and leaves it as an enigma. He can't come up with a sort of an acceptable explanation there. Sorry.
You go.
No,
go
carry
ahead.
on. Do come back if you want.
No, I was going to say that I did read the whole of the book, but not the appendices. So possibly I've come unstuck on not reading your appendices. But well,
I don't think.
Do you want?
You need to. So it's not as I say, it's not a criticism. I don't inflict that on anyone.
Well, no. I mean, I enjoyed reading the book, but when I got to the end of the book, I sort of thought, well, I don't need to read the appendices, because that was what I was focusing on, was the arguments you put forward in the book. But I mean, why do you think that the apostles wouldn't have shown the empty tomb? Wouldn't that have been quite a? Because I mean, one of the things that strikes me is how there is this Christian idea that the empty tomb is so compelling. It's so compelling, And a lot of people will say, when I start to lose my faith, I just think, well, the empty tomb. Mm-hmm. And I just think if it's supposed to be so compelling 2,000 years later, why wasn't it compelling at the time? About perhaps, sorry, I don't want to kind of overload you with a multiple question, but it does also lead to this idea that again, according to the Gospels, the fact that the tomb was empty was so unimpressive to everyone else. I mean, the guards at the tomb are not, who are amongst, apparently, as described, amongst the closest people, amongst the first witnesses to the empty tomb, but they're not, they're not thinking, oh goodness, perhaps we better rethink our approach.
They're willing to be paid off as well.
And they're willing to be,
which is strange, isn't it? If you've actually seen an angel come down. And
okay, we're cool with that if the money's right. Yes,
yeah, that's right.
and the chief priests, although they didn't see it, they are supposed to get one of the first versions, and they're not at all bothered that, well, the God we serve sounds like he intervened in this case. They're like, oh, well, we don't want the governor to know. We wouldn't want to upset the governor. We must make sure we do something to keep the governor on side. And you would. Anyway, that's rather a portmanteau question. I apologise, but I just thought I'd get all 3 points in, and I will now sort of sit back and allow you.
No, I think what you say is interesting, because of course the guards and everything that goes with that is unique to Matthew. There's this big question about is this based on any sort of eyewitness evidence, or is this some sort of, to put it bluntly, fabrication by Matthew? If it's a fabrication, to explain the fact that no, the disciples didn't steal the body, which is what he then says. Well, that's the rumor that's doing the rounds, and it would really it'd have to be really clever, wouldn't it, if it was actually he was making up a story to sort of create the rumor that he's saying that he's rebutting as an explanation for the empty tomb.
There is a point on that though, Graeme, which I remember reading in a book, and I was quite surprised at how the guy put it, but it really struck a thing with me. And Francis, you almost tapped into it really, which was that it's strikingly odd that the Sanhedrin and everyone else and there's basically guards sent to the tomb because they'd heard about Jesus raising from the third day, and so they're right outside the tomb making sure whatever. And the disciples had no idea. They were off going home.
I thought I'd loaded enough multiple questions into my address to Graeme without bunging in yet another one. But,
I know, even when they
you've made the point. I don't know. Do you want to deal with that, Graeme?
Well, I can't remember the precise wording. Maybe you can help me as to whether that they are actually expecting him to rise, or whether they're expecting something fishy, maybe with his disciples, to happen on the third day.
No, but the guards were sent there because they'd heard the teaching that they was expecting to rise. So it's funny how there's 12 disciples weren't camped out there with a cup of tea and a fire ready for you know what I mean? They had gone home.
I think they say something like, that rascal said he'd rise again in 3 days. We must put a guard there so his disciples don't steal the body and claim he's risen. And yet the disciples, even when they see the empty tomb, they're not the outsiders are so on the money. They're so on the money, like, this is what he predicted. And the disciples are like, oh, empty tomb. What's happened? No idea. What's going on?
In John, he said he went back home. They just like, okay, there's nothing to see here now. And so what a striking, now to me, a later literary invention makes sense totally of that, because it isn't something that was happening historically. But that to me is something that helps that view. Anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. Perhaps it would be time to wrap up this section. And I suppose if to sum up as briefly as I can, I think there are more implausibilities about believing what led up to the empty tomb and what happened immediately after the empty tomb than there are in any of the other theories, aside from Jesus didn't really die, but the theories of, still in the tomb, communal grave, somebody stole the body, even if we don't quite know how. And yes, that I don't think there was any good reason for the authorities to take to try and produce the body. So that's my brief summary of what I want to say. And I'd like to leave the last word to you, Graeme. If you'd like to come back to any of that.
I think it's important, if I take a step back, to say, as I concede in the book, it's possible that people may form the view that the empty tomb is not something that they can accept with any force. It's interesting, on Amazon, one of the reviews of my book, and I don't pay too much attention to them, I have to say, what said was the effect of, well, here's another book that says, oh, empty tomb, slam dunk, that's it. That's the case for the resurrection. And I very much, that wasn't my intention at all. It was one of a number of things that need to be explained. Now, I think I've dealt fairly with the various other hypotheses apart from the empty tomb. I certainly, when I was writing, it seemed to me that there was a pretty high level of consensus that there had been an empty tomb and that some explanation was required of that. But that's not just by evangelical scholars. It is by including people like Bart Ehrman, historian like Michael Grant, but various other people. But as I say, I accept that that's something where people may form a different view.
Okay, well, I think it's time for you to step up to the plate then, Ed.
Okay, oh, lovely. So I'm going to sort of talk about ask about the material of how the disciples changed and how the church grew. Where did all that come from?
Yeah.
And to a large degree, as I kind of hinted earlier on, I'm kind of on board with your argument with that, and it seems to me clear that belief in the resurrection goes really early into the church history. So almost right from the start, and it would seem very likely that what we could call a resurrection event of some kind was the thing that gave birth to Christianity. So that's why the church grew. We mentioned that's why some of the key people were happy to be martyred. It seems, even though a lot of the martyr stories are fabricated later, some of the core close ones, like maybe James, the brother of Jesus, and James the Apostle, those sort of people, they're better attested. If I can lay my cards on the table, that I go for the idea that the resurrection originally was an ethereal kind of resurrection, that people didn't believe it as a physical resurrection right from the start, and that grew later. So you see the kind of tension in Paul's writing between the two. And I pick up N.T. Wright's good on this. And I'm assuming you read the N.T. Wright book, about 700 pages. So he talks about how the understanding of resurrection was largely physical right back in the day before Jesus came along. And so that's sort of part of why we think that there is this physical aspect of the resurrection, because a lot of the people who started believing it, maybe not firsthand, would have assumed so, because that was their understanding of what resurrection was. So what do you what's your basis for thinking, say, that Paul thought that the resurrection was physical and not just a spiritual vision?
Yeah, I mean, in 1 Corinthians 9, he uses the words, have I not seen Jesus, or have I seen Jesus our Lord? Then he goes on, obviously, in the very well-known and much quoted passage in chapter 15 to list those that he has appeared to. There are other references elsewhere in Paul which seem to me very strongly to suggest that he's talking about something that talking about a physical experience, if I can call it that, rather than, to use your words, an ethereal experience.
Yeah.
Also, just while I think of it, and sorry, it's not directly on the point on Paul at all, but it occurred to me when I was thinking about this that assuming that we're talking about some sort of ethereal experience, particularly if we do discard the empty tomb, then where does the early move to get together and celebrate this and commemorate it on a Sunday come from?
Well, if we go for hallucination as it's one of the theories you label, and I'm kind of happy to go with that, then the first hallucination could have been on the Sunday.
Yeah, I suppose it could have been. But it would have to, are we talking about hallucination of one person? That's good enough to start a whole movement on a Sunday?
Yeah, I think so. If it was
hmm.
Peter.
Yeah, I really don't buy the hallucination theory, as I think you know but I don't know if you want to move on to that yet, or whether you're still wanting to stick with Paul.
Well, yes, I'm pretty convinced that if you take Paul's writings, he doesn't really have in mind much of a physicality to it. That creed in Philippians 2 about how Jesus sort of he was equal with God, but made himself of human nature. Then when the resurrection comes by in that little hymn or creed or whatever we would call it, he goes straight from the grave to glory. Mm-hmm. So the ascension is sort of on Easter morning, as it were. And then when Paul is quoted talking about his experience of Jesus, he calls it heavenly vision.
Well, that's once, isn't it, in Acts 26? And I know, I mean, that's not the primary source, is it? And particularly if you're looking at pushing the dating of that back, you've really got to look at what Paul himself says, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely. But he says, he gives this sort of testimony is how I do it, because I've been a good Christian. So Paul gives his testimony in Galatians chapter 1. So this is his own words. And he talks about kind of going to persecute the church, and then we get to the Damascus event. I don't think he says the word Damascus, but he says God revealed himself in me, or and the Greek word is difficult to translate, but NIV goes for in me, and some of the other translations do. So it doesn't feel to me like Paul had a physical encounter with Jesus. It was a vision. It was of someone who was a spiritual being, had a spiritual body. Was a key word in 1 Corinthians 15 is that he encountered Jesus as a life-giving spirit.
Yeah, although you've also got the and if you've N.T. Wright goes through this in some detail, the translation issues about the distinction Paul draws between soma psychikon and soma pneumatikon, or however they're pronounced. I'm not a Greek scholar myself.
Yeah, so that's spiritual body versus corruptible body. I forget what natural body, I think is the English translation.
Yeah, although it's some have actually translated it as physical body. And Wright is very much saying, well, no, this what we're talking about here is what animates the body, not the substance of the body. Is it animated by the soul, or is it animated by the spirit? And both of those seem to be talking, when you look at the way in which Paul uses the same words without the word the preceding word body elsewhere in the letter, very much at physical bodies.
Are you saying
the body is physical?
That Jesus came back physically then?
Sorry?
Are you saying Jesus came back, as it were, to see Paul?
Yeah.
As in physically, like a second coming, but before the second coming?
Yeah, which is why Paul relates to it as being very, very much out of time. Well, I can't remember the words there.
Abnormally born.
Abnormally born, yeah. Yeah.
That's very interesting, because I've never really picked up that from even evangelical peoples, that was what was happening with Paul, that it was much more something sort of, I don't know, sort of like a window into the heavenlies, see a figure, much more like a vision or some kind of window, but not actually like Jesus is back, you know, before they said he will one day return, you know. That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't buy this sort of animated the contrast is between the corruptible kind of, it's going to decay, a natural body, and the kind of glorious in heaven spiritual body, which is called life-giving spirit. So the body side is dropped. What I see going on there is Paul kind of walking a tightrope, because we know from N.T. Wright's work and just generally that the culture had in mind that resurrection was physical, but the experiences that the early people had were spiritual. It could have been visions, like a hallucination, but basically there wasn't a body eating fish that was no longer on the plate after the vision had happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, to me, it's a sort of standard line. Are you familiar with the minimal facts?
I'm familiar with it as a theory. I'm aware that different people produce different lists.
Yeah. So the idea here is that this goes back to Gary Habermas, and Mike Licona has picked up on it a lot as well, to American scholars. And he's got a lot of traction, particularly Gary's kind of lectured on it a lot and written books. Yeah. And he says that the empty tomb isn't a minimal fact by his criterion, which is that it's sort of overwhelmingly agreed upon by scholars. About 75% of, no, I think 66% of them, I think it's his latest number he gave to Justin on one of the unbelievable episodes that I heard. And and that's based on his survey of scholars where more than that number are kind of conservative, is according to his label. So it's not, it tends to be a conservative idea that the empty tomb is a fact to be explained.
I'm aware it's not on his list, certainly.
Yeah.
But as I say, I've seen various lists, and I haven't, to be honest, I haven't had the time, or indeed these days the inclination, to delve into the number and theological views of the scholars that those lists are claimed to be compiled on.
Yeah. There's not. I got this from his website, and it's not that easy. But he's writing some enormous, I think, the two-volume tome, where hopefully this will all be explained.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you don't have a lot of time for hallucination theory. What's your main issue with that? In the writing of Paul that you mentioned before?
Sorry, say again. I missed the last.
Your pushback against my idea of hallucinations being the kind of thing that prompted resurrection belief.
Yeah, I think I deal fairly often with in the work I do with people. No, not that often. I deal sometimes with people who labour under hallucinations or delusions, they always seem to me to be very temporary things. I think of my mother-in-law. I know it's a different situation in the early stages of dementia. We arrived at her house one day to find her having her evening meal with her son. 2 plates on the table, she was sat eating. Her son had died several years before. We pointed this out to her, and she realised that this was just something that was not happening. But she'd been sufficiently convinced of it briefly to actually make the meal and so on. But I just don't think that these are things that are persist long enough and are strong enough to have this sort of effect to motivate this sort of level of life change. It's certainly not even if maybe in one person, in a large number of people. I just don't see it.
Yes, I get the criticism concerning a large number of people. I would have thought only 1 or 2 people had hallucinations, and that was like the priming factor for the belief in others. Because there's a lot else going on than just the hallucination. There's the whole cognitive dissonance idea, where if you give your life to a cause and then you have disconfirming evidence, you find a way of ignoring the evidence and you kind of believe stronger in a way. That's the sort of original Fessinger response.
There are also documented mass hallucinations, though. I know that's something that a lot of evangelicals say that doesn't happen, but I was just reading some this week. There's loads of Catholic ones. Thousands of people absolutely swear they all saw Mary together and cry, and the statue have tears. And there's different ones. There's loads. There's quite a lot of them, actually. But I was reading one particular one, and all the evidence for them so overwhelmingly stronger than anything you find in the Gospels, and I still don't believe it.
Yeah, there's a Caro one, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
In 1968,
and the one I was reading was 1916. I think it's called something to do. This was the one that involved Mary and the Son dancing,
The Fatima one.
Yeah, Fatima one. Yeah. And so when you've got hundreds and hundreds of people testifying to something's going on in a group way that most of us don't think actually happened, particularly the sun dancing. And yet the testimonies were as powerful as what we Christians might actually say that the disciples had. They were that strong. And so what do you make of that?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I've not read any of those.
Right.
But the stuff I've read up on about hallucinations is a long time ago now.
Right.
Generally didn't suggest that level of belief would come out of something that was merely a hallucination.
Okay.
Before I kind of finish off, it seems to me that God has he's in control of all of this. So he'd raised Jesus from the dead, and he organized for whatever level of evidence we have left behind. And it seems to me he didn't choose a particularly good set of evidence. He could have had Pilate write the report to Rome about these amazing events, and we don't quite understand what's going on, but the bodies disappeared and all these Christians are running about saying they've seen Jesus. But that kind of document could have happened, and God could have made sure it did happen and got preserved in the records in Rome and reappeared in a way that could be verified by modern scholarship. But that wasn't part of it. So do you think God was in charge of how much evidence we have got from history? And do you think he did a good enough job, or he wanted to leave things a bit vague, or what do you feel about that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, you could push it back even further if you think about it. You could say, well, hang on, God, why didn't you arrange for all this to happen in the 21st century, where you've got, instant access to mobile phone footage and everything else? At the end of the day, these are huge theological questions. I don't purport to be a theologian. What I do say, though, is that I'm very much a believer in the fact that we're dealing here not just with God, but with free will. Maybe God did have a go at persuading Pilate to actually document it, and Pilate, in his own of his own volition, didn't. And I don't believe that God is in either the position or the business of overriding free will in that way. The simple answer is I don't know, but I think you've got to factor that in. I mean, yes, it would be, in a sense, it would be great, wouldn't it? It would be great from my point of view, if the evidence was so overwhelming that only somebody who was going to completely shut their eyes to the evidence and sort of put their hands in their ears and sing la 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 wouldn't believe it. We're not in that position, which I think it does make it incumbent on us, and which is why I'm really glad that this is something you're doing, to actually look at the evidence and look at the issues. God is challenging us to think about them, to use. In fact, I think I say it in the book. God is actually challenging us to actually use our minds. It's not being spoon-fed to us.
Is there anything else you'd like to say on these topics before we move on?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Yep, lovely. Because we all agreed it's definitely you need to make sure you had the last word.
Mm.
Is there anything kind of general? We have a general chit chat before we close off.
Just on an aside, I remember talking about this thing about why didn't Jesus come today? I remember being a very young teen Christian and thinking, why didn't he come at the time of Cain and Abel? And why didn't he get rid of the serpent straight off the bat, and start it all properly again right at that point before the human race could even expand, but that was my teenage thinking at the time. Why did it have to wait so long until the Roman period? And so it's interesting, isn't it? What we could think could have happened in a theological sense, I mean. Yeah.
No, I think if I just can say, I mean, I'm it's really good of you to ask me on and to have a very free and wide-ranging conversation. I very much get the impression that I've not persuaded you that you're going to change your views. likewise in return. But it's a very wide-ranging subject. The book I've written on it is very short. It is very much at a popular level. And Ed has mentioned N.T. Wright's book, which is, I can't remember, 600-700 pages long.
Massive, yeah.
Which goes into which goes into huge detail on a lot of the issues, which some of which we've skated around. I know it doesn't deal with some at all. There's a huge amount of literature out there if people are interested in it.
Well, I think we'd all like to express our thanks to you, Graeme, for coming on to talk to us, talk with us about your book, and particularly what I know has been quite a busy week for you. And very much enjoyed the conversation, which I hope all our listeners will find interesting, because I think we've covered some pretty interesting points.
Lovely.
Thanks, Graeme.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Graeme.
So until next time, and for anybody that wants to email us in on doubtsaloud@gmail.com, please do. And so until next time, whatever subject we're doing, which I don't know what it is
we've
yet.
Yet to sort out.
Actually, it might be, does God have a body?
Oh, yes.
Which is a subject that I'm really interested in, and in another modern scholarship kind of move as well at the moment. And so that's going to be an interesting one. So anyway, but for now and for this time, I have been your host, Andrew.
I've been Francis.
I'm Ed.
I'm Graeme. I don't know if I meant to say that or not, but I have.
Lovely.
Yes,
Bye.
you are. Yes. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
That's great. I can use all of that because it just adds to the humour.
Well
adds to the humour. It's great.
Yeah, we're not into professional slickness.
No. Slick is our USP is non-slick. Warts and all.
Non-slick.
Brilliant, Graeme. Thank you.
Yes, thanks ever so much. That was great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry I didn't have as much time to revise as I otherwise would. Just to let you, fortunately, I think I said to Francis, I had to stand in at relatively short notice to take our service yesterday because our minister went down with COVID.
Fortunately,
Fortunately, he's just got cold-like symptoms.
Right.
Also, my granddaughter had to go into A&E, so it's been a bit of a hectic weekend. But never mind.
Thank you considering stepping in to be the lion's den.
She's fine as well. But no, I thought, well, if I ask to postpone it, something else is going to happen. Life is like that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, well, we do appreciate it, and it was lovely to meet you.
Yes.
And you keep up the good work.
Thank you, Graeme.
CPS, I mean, not being atheist.
Not being atheists.
No. Can I just ask? Sorry, I don't want to keep anyone, but I'm interested because I don't know what Andrew and Ed, what area of work you're both in.
Work. I've always worked in sort of video production and website design, tech stuff, and I do that in a support role in an academy school at the moment, and it's basically techie and media support, graphic design and stuff. But as in terms of my background in sort of Christianity, I actually studied at Spurgeon's Bible College.
I didn't know Spurgeon's. I knew you mentioned it.
This was back. Funny enough, I started 20 years ago. This October coming, which shocked me the other day. I went up to 2006, and that was a lot of unraveling and sort of very thoughtful period for me. And that was the beginning of, funny enough, beginning of the end. Was actually studying, but in a very slow way, not instant or overnight.
That tends, from what I've heard, to happen more at sort of mainstream universities than places like Spurgeon's.
I think it was because they got me to engage in lots of interesting things, which made me read the more progressive, more liberal books, which I found so much more informative, honest, and just making more sense that I couldn't deny it. And so I think it wasn't to do with them being evangelical. It was we were meant to sort of do essays, not that they said this, but you felt that you were meant to sort of engage with these books, but obviously come up with the evangelical response. And I found myself stuck with the books and not coming up with the evangelical response. And it's like, whoa. And these not necessarily non-Christian, they're just more liberal, not evangelical, basically. And then that opened Pandora's box into many, many, many other areas slowly. Very different story to Ed.
Yeah, what are you into, Ed, and what's your background?
Well, my background's engineering, water engineering, developing,
right,
isn't it, kind of thing. I was brought up by atheists and became a Christian as a teenager. My sister became a Christian first, she's older sister. And I was very keen for nearly 20 years, but had sort of big doubts and things, and jumped into, actually Westminster College, Oxford. I didn't study there, but the library allowed me in, and I borrowed lots of books and read loads, and ended up an atheist.
Presumably you know about our study group, Graeme.
Sorry?
Presumably you do know about our study group. I mean, this podcast came out of the group that Ed set up, and I co-host with him. And Francis basically was there, weren't you, from roughly the beginning, I think?
Yes. I'm not one of the. I don't help you run the group. It's a discussion group. It's a meetup group. If you're interested,
once a month up in King's Cross.
We once a month. We've been doing it virtually, but it's the Skeptics Believers meetup, and so we can send you a link. But
it's basically like this, but with a wider
probably
group.
Pretty busy, and you might feel, but it's the sort of thing you can drop in or not,
depending on the subject.
Depending on the subject.
Yeah, no, I can't make any commitments, but by all means, drop me a link. That sounds interesting. Yeah. I'm currently in Stafford, and I'm moving at the end of June permanently to Stoke-on-Trent, Crown Court.
Oh, right. Okay.
So, so certainly in terms of physically dropping in, that's
a non-starter. I agree.
Well, if you get one of Ed's spiritual bodies, you might be able to materialize.
Or if I can polylocate, I think was the word Francis used. That would be really helpful. That would.
It would, wouldn't it? Oh, the things you could do if you could polylocate.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Good.
Okay. Well, enjoy the rest of your evening, and thanks again for joining us.
Great. Good to meet you all.
Thank you.
Yes, nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.